Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this AEI Book Talk. I'm Robert Dorr, and I'm very pleased to welcome to AEI Fredrik Logevall, whose outstanding new book, JFK, Coming of Age in the American Century, 1917 to 1956, brings new light and understanding to the oft-told story of the rise of America's 35th president, John F. Kennedy. Now, a little background on our guest today. Professor Logevall is the Lawrence D. Belfer Professor of International Affairs and Professor of History at Harvard University. He's the author of 9 books, including Embers of War, A History of Vietnam from 1900 to 1959, which won the Pulitzer Prize. His book on the rise of John Kennedy is the first volume of what is expected to be a 2-volume biography. Professor Logevall, welcome to AEI.
I'm so pleased to be with you, and I look forward to our discussion today.
Yes, I am too, and I hope our audience will permit us to just have a discussion, a back and forth dialogue, as opposed to a straight talk and then questions after. There's so much in the book that's worth exploring, and that, frankly, I have some questions about, and so I'm hoping that we can have some fun with this. Now, I also want you to know, Professor, that AEI, which thinks of itself as kind of a right of center or conservative in its principles, is sprinkled with many scholars and supporters who admire John Kennedy and what he stood for. And I'm not just talking about the Catholics. Many of our scholars and researchers and supporters and students admired President Kennedy's views on communism, national defense, tax policy, civil rights, social policy, the role of faith in someone's life and in America. So it's nice to read a biography that offers some explanation for this phenomena, especially at a time when the popular understanding of President Kennedy is in some ways distorted by partisanship or caricature, more influenced by our own current obsessions than with historical facts. So I'm just very pleased to have you and to have this opportunity to talk about your terrific book. So I want to begin by asking you, again, we'll go back to his early life, and to talk about one aspect of the book that you cover very well, and I think you plow new ground in understanding of him. And that is in describing a distinction between his intellectual development and views and those of his older brother, Joe, and his father, Joseph Kennedy Sr. How did they develop differently? How was he different than these 2 other large influences in his life?
It's a great question, Robert. I think fundamentally, in broad terms, he saw a more complex world than did either Joe Sr. or Joe Jr. He had a sense, I think, for the intangibles in human affairs. He had, to a degree at least, a romantic imagination, which was one of the reasons he was drawn, by the way, to Winston Churchill, a man whose appeal his father, Joe Kennedy, as ambassador to Britain, could never understand. It's an interesting difference between the 2 of them, how they viewed Churchill. I think also then, more particularly, Jack Kennedy's views differed or developed differently because he was sick a lot as a child. He therefore read voraciously, especially in European history and statecraft. Biography was a genre that really appealed to him. And I think his brother did not have that kind of interest in reading, interest in some ways in the written word, in history and biography, nor did his father. That comes more in some ways from his mother, interestingly enough. Rose, who maybe we'll talk about today, I think often gets slighted in discussions of JFK, but she, much more than his father, passed on to Jack this interest in history. And then I guess finally I would say that he came to determine, in part because of his own international travels, his coursework at Harvard, I think, Robert, he came to see, and I argue this in the book, this is a really interesting period, I think, in 39-40. So just as he's finishing, and of course the war is starting, I think he came to believe that isolationism was untenable for the United States. Appeasement, the topic of his senior thesis, had been a terrible mistake. His brother was never able to accept that, in part because his brother was not willing to separate himself from their father. And Joe Kennedy, of course, was an arch appeaser, a supporter of isolationism to the end. Jack was much more comfortable than his brother in charting his own path. It's a theme in the book.
And I'm struck in the book about the extent to which he traveled in key, important, pivotal places, Germany, England, all around the world at a very young age. And so the stereotype or the caricature of sort of a shallow, flippant young man, it just doesn't fit with someone who's reading so much and traveling so much and so curious. Give us a sense of just, I mean, to young people in the audience, you think that by 1940, he'd already been to all the major capitals of the world, it seemed like.
Yeah. Well, he's a little bit, I think I had this line in the book at some point and then it fell out in the editing, but he's a kind of Zelig type figure. Or I also thought a little bit about Forrest Gump in the movie, because you're right. He does JFK as a college student, does appear in all of these places. All of a sudden he pops up in Berlin, and then he's in Moscow. He sees various parts of the Middle East. He has this extraordinary, I guess today we would call it a study abroad experience in his junior year. So for about 7 months, he takes time away from Harvard with permission, obviously, of the deans, and travels for about 7 months. 1939, before the beginning of his final year, and with his father's help, because his father again is ambassador to London, so he's able to basically facilitate, to arrange for meetings with top diplomats and other officials in these capitals, and he travels, usually solo, and digests what he learns, stores it away. He has the kind of experience I suggest in the book that no future president since John Quincy Adams has had, which is an amazing thing. And as you say, it cuts against this notion of a kind of playboy who's just out for a good time, who's not very serious until he gets into Congress. On the contrary, I suggest that you see from this point, and indeed to some extent even before these travels, somebody who's passionately interested in, especially international affairs, learns about them, and I think profits from this experience in lots of ways.
And then he returns to Harvard and he buckles down and he writes up, I'm sort of wanting to give your sense of it from the standpoint of a teacher at Harvard now. He writes a 100-page college thesis, has some grammatical errors and typos and things like that, but he clearly did it himself based on his own research. How does Why England Slept as a college thesis hold up? And also as a historian, how do you relate to it in a serious way?
It's really interesting, actually, your question. I'm not sure I've gotten that one before. What's happened, and I do allude to this gingerly in the book, and I'm not the first to say this, is that something called great inflation has crept into our system, not only here, but I think elsewhere. And I suspect that the thesis today would get a higher final grade than it got in 1940. I think today it would be probably a magna cum laude.
Well, you described that one person suggested magna, and someone said, no, it's not magna.
It's too sloppy, too many errors, and so he didn't get that in the end. I'm not sure even today if it would be Summa, because even today Summa is hard to get. So I think where you see that great inflation, interestingly enough, more is in course grades, more perhaps in some of the grades he got on individual papers. There's one paper that I discussed, I think in his sophomore year, that got a D+. And I suggest in parentheses in the book, as you may recall, that today, it would probably be a B, or it would be a higher grade.
Did you see the paper? You read the paper? So
yeah, of course. Sure. And so I thought, what would I give this paper today? And I decided I'd probably have to give it.
Well, you guys have gotten so easy. That's what's going on.
Way too easy. Way too easy. Now, your second question, which is more important, I guess, historically, is how should we evaluate this thing? I think it's, as I say in the book, I think it's a real contribution to knowledge. It's not every senior thesis about which I think we would say that it's an original contribution to our understanding, in this case, of British appeasement and the reasons why, and this was the fundamental question for him. Why was it that Great Britain, which came out of World War I arguably in a very strong position, the empire was as big as it had ever been, Germany was prostrate, the British looked really good. How do we get, Jack Kennedy wanted to know, from that to this position in 1939-40, when the outlook for the British seems so dire? And so he's interested in the appeasement policy.
Yeah.
And I think it's a very intelligent piece of work, and I recommend he revised it slightly, although it's substantially, I argue, the same as the thesis. But the book that came out just a month or two after his graduation, France has fallen. It's a very precarious time. I think it's a very solid piece of work, and as you suggest, Robert, it's really his own work. His father did help in getting documents sent to his son. So he had certain advantages that other thesis writers at Harvard didn't have, to be sure. But in terms of the actual writing, the nature of the argument, which argued that systemic forces, British public opinion, to some degree special interest groups, were in some ways more important in accounting for the appeasement policy than maybe the individual decisions of Stanley Baldwin and Neville Chamberlain. Not every historian is going to accept that argument, but I think people, even serious specialists, would take the argument of this young college student seriously even today.
And then as the war came, he got again, the stereotype is that his older brother was the star of the family and he was sort of a trailer. But I think you described that he got into the war sooner. He was a higher rank, and he was off to a faster start in serving the United States in the military than his older brother, who took a little time and remained isolationist quite late.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think again this relationship between the brothers, to some extent, sibling rivalry. There's no question there was one. Is a kind of theme in the book. I think that Joe Jr. took that rivalry more seriously than Jack did, even though Joe, or maybe because Joe, was, as you say, the golden child. He was the one about whom there were such great expectations, not least from the parents. I think it really began to gnaw at Joe that Jack, he's the one who had his senior thesis published. He was 2 years ahead of Jack at Harvard. He didn't get his senior thesis published, even though they tried. And then, as you say, he has this experience in the South Pacific, the ramming of PT 109, which of course I deal with at length. The torpedo boat that JFK commanded is rammed. I certainly wouldn't defend him on seeing his boat rammed, but his actions thereafter in saving himself and his crew, I think, are genuinely heroic. It became front page news in the United States. And as you say, Joe was not able to experience that in the degree that he wanted. Ultimately, Joe was killed in the war in 1945. And though I can't prove this, I don't think anybody can, I do think Joe's decision to volunteer for a very dangerous mission.
Ooh, very dangerous mission.
It was kind of almost a suicide mission, really. It's a kind of flying bomb. So they load the plane with explosives, and then he and his co-pilot are supposed to bail, and the plane will continue on its path into the coast, into coastal France, while it blows up before they can bail. I think that's in part his decision, because he could have come home before this.
Yeah.
He had fulfilled his service. I think it's in part about wanting to match his younger brother's exploits.
Very heroic.
And he died.
Brave, but now I want to talk about the PT 109, because again, you cover that very well, and you cover it without sort of, hero worship. And from the perspective of the men who served with Jack Kennedy on the boat, What was their view of his efforts to save them after the boat had been rammed?
Well, I looked into this closely. I wanted to know not only what they said in oral histories 20 years later. Oral histories have their place, and I use them. They're very valuable. But let's be honest, especially if they're conducted after the assassination, people's memories have faded. There's probably an inclination to boost JFK's actions. So I wanted to also to know what they said at the time, right in the aftermath of the rescue, when they wrote home to their parents, what commanding officers had to say about JFK's actions. And it was universally positive. I did not find anybody who questioned his actions that he took. The boat that has been split in two and is about to sink, he has to decide, how am I going to save myself and my crew? And he takes various actions, which I describe in the book and which others have talked about, to do that. It involves an epic swim, among other things, that lasts about 4 hours, in which he is towing an injured crew member. But I think, to a man, these crew members, these members of PT 109, plus the superior officers, laud his actions as being selfless. There's a kind of unflappability, which is part of JFK's character, a certain coolness under fire that he admired in other people, and I think he actually showed here as well. In addition to quick thinking and courage, it's all there.
The other thing that's in it that I found interesting is, of course, the Kennedys are from tremendous wealth. I mean,
Yeah.
Harvard, really great, richest men in America. He's a product of that family. But he's working with enlisted men and soldiers and people from entirely different backgrounds. And it seemed to me that his leadership and his charm, as you describe it, appealed to them, and regardless of where they came from or who they were. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about this quality of charm or lovability or humor that he had. It's not a made up thing. It was a real phenomenon.
I think it was a real phenomenon. I give him credit for this. Perhaps there's also credit due to his parents, because they had taught their 9 children to, I think, respect others. There was a commitment to public service. Maybe you and I will talk a little bit more about that as we proceed. So maybe this comes in part also from his upbringing. His grandfather on his mother's side, the legendary Boston politician John Honey Fitzgerald, also had this sense that I think he imparted to Jack and to Joe Jr., which is, the people I deal with in Boston politics are ordinary people, and it's important that you respect them, that you treat people the same. I think Jack Kennedy did that, and again, there's contemporaneous evidence for this. That is to say, people who interacted with him in the war zone said that even though he was a member of one of America's wealthiest families, as you said, this is the son of an ambassador, he didn't show that in his existence. In fact, I quote some people who say, I had no idea who Jack Kennedy was when I interacted with him, and it was only later on. So I think that helps to account for this likability, as you said. On top of that, there is a kind of self-deprecating sense of humor, which I think is really important, and by the way, is one of the reasons for his success as a politician later. A kind of charm, as you said, that is here. It's an appealing part of his personality, combined with a certain reserve that I think also works for him, both politically, but also here in the war.
Now, I want to ask you just one last question about his social or his personal relations, because it struck me as I kind of want to know how you got that and why do they exist. And this is, he had a friendship, a very close friendship, with a woman who, for some reason or other, was being surveilled, or who was being surveilled, that led to you having transcripts of the young John Kennedy's phone calls with this woman that he was in a relationship with. I just find it worries, it makes me sad about America that someone was listening in to a 22-year-old's conversation. But why did that happen? And how did you how did you acquire them?
Well, it's an extraordinary part of this whole story, because this is in some ways the love of his life, at least until Jackie comes along. Inga Arvad, Danish former beauty queen, journalist, very intelligent woman. One of the reasons he fell in love with her was because she was so evidently smart, spoke several languages. She was a few years older than he was. So she was also cosmopolitan in a way that I think he really admired. And they fell in love. She was, by this point, a journalist in Washington. The reason why she was under FBI surveillance was because she was a suspected Nazi spy. She had been a journalist with a Danish newspaper earlier in the 30s. She had interviewed Hitler. She got on well with other Nazi leaders. She, I think, attended Goering's wedding. Hitler reportedly called her the perfect example of Nordic beauty, or something to that effect. So J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI got wind of this, and she was put under surveillance. So, as you say, here is this young couple, first in Washington, right around Pearl Harbor, 41, early 42. Then when he's transferred to Charleston, South Carolina, they continue to bug his rooms. They go through her mail. His rooms when she's visiting. So she is the one that is under surveillance. They go through her apartment. They have somebody stake out her apartment. And for a long time, they can't figure out who is this naval officer who keeps coming to see her, because she's married also, we should note. So this is a very important, I think, relationship for him. And in the letters and in these FBI, the transcripts of these conversations, we see, I think, a side of JFK that we don't often see, where he lets down this reserve. He shows how much he cares about her. And when the relationship breaks up, in part because of pressure from his father, basically his father says, Jack, you cannot be with a woman who's married, who's a suspected spy, and who is older than you are. That's a problematic trifecta, to say the least.
I don't even know if she was Catholic. I mean, who knows?
No, she was a Protestant. So then you have a fourth problem here. Right. So he breaks up the relationship, but as I show in the book, he remains deeply, and I think.
Well, I think you show later that she pushes him away.
Well, there's when he wants to rekindle things after he returns from the South Pacific, she basically says no. In part because she knows that he's politically ambitious. His father is ambitious for him, and this is never going to work. So she, I think, still has feelings for JFK, but she's not going to resume this relationship. And I think he struggles with that for a very long time. The other thing that's worth just saying here briefly is there's a suggestion by many authors that John F. Kennedy only decided to pursue a political career after Joe Jr. was killed in 1944. Yeah. Well, these FBI transcripts show that he and Inga are musing about, or sort of bantering about, his becoming a politician in 1942, long before Joe Jr. is killed. Yeah. They even talk about the presidency. She says, I can see you rising to the very top. And so it suggests here that JFK went into politics at least partly for his own reasons, not simply because of his brother's death.
So just one last question on this. Was she a spy?
I don't think she was. I've seen no evidence to that effect. I looked hard for this. There's a limit to what's available, but I don't think that she was. It is possible that there was a certain admiration for what the Nazis were achieving in the early period. So 34, 35, 36, maybe, when she's a journalist. Mm-hmm. By the way, Joe Kennedy Jr. had that admiration, as I talk about in the book. Joe Kennedy Sr. had it to some extent, so she would have been far from alone in this. But that's different from
Charles
any
Lindbergh.
suggestion that she was a spy. Or Charles Lindbergh, I write about. Yeah, I think no. I don't think she was a spy.
So now we come back. He's come back from the war. He gets ready to go into politics. He runs for Congress, and it's really we could talk about his entry into politics, and maybe you'd like to describe that. But I'm really interested in that race, the 1952 Senate vote.
Yeah.
And what strikes me about the couple things about that, first, just give us the lay of the land in that race and his opponent, and to what extent was his opponent philosophically, ideologically, personally different from John F. Kennedy? Weren't they pretty much the same thing, just dressed up in slightly different clothes?
They were really similar in so many ways, and I write about that. And in fact, voters in 52. So it's Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. A lot of Massachusetts voters basically said, "I wish we could have them both." They were in many respects cut from the same cloth. They respected each other. There were two debates, and it's interesting, by the way, that Lodge was the one who asked for debates. So that tells you something. By the middle of 52, quite belatedly, Lodge is thinking, this is not going to be the cakewalk that I thought. And in fact, Jack Kennedy, one of the secrets of Jack Kennedy's success in all of his campaigns, 46 for the House in the 11th district, the major races, and let's not include his re-election campaigns, 46 for the House, 52 for the Senate, and 60 for the presidency. A secret of his success is that he starts earlier and he works harder than his opponents. It's a lesson for today's politicians as well. And he was, in effect, he wasn't quite sure which race he would get. Would it be the governorship?
Right.
Would it be the Senate race? But he was basically running for an office in Massachusetts, a statewide office, in 49 and 50. And Lodge came to the realization late that he was losing, really only about Labor Day of 1952, if you can imagine, because he had been so involved in getting Eisenhower to the top of the Republican ticket that he neglected his own campaign. He asks for debates. JFK agrees to two of them. And you can see it's fascinating to go back and listen or to read the transcripts of those debates, the degree to which they were very similar, these two men. There was not a lot to distinguish them. And I quote somebody, a journalist, who I think put it pretty well. He said, Jack Kennedy had everything that Henry Cabot Lodge had in terms of his good looks, his knowledge of the issues, his wartime service, and he had one more thing, which is that he made people want to do something for him. Yeah. There was this they were inundated with volunteers in the Kennedy campaign. And there was this uncanny ability that he had to connect with voters that exceeded even what Lodge was able to do. And it may have made the difference in a really close race in, by the way, a Republican year. It's fascinating that Eisenhower absolutely crushes Stevenson in Massachusetts, beats him by 200,000 votes. And yet JFK goes against this, beats Lodge by about 70,000 votes.
Now, there was an important constituency in that vote, in that election, and similar constituency to one we know a little bit about in more recent times. Yeah. The sort of working class, socially conservative, labor, white, anti-communist, and pro-Joe McCarthy. Yeah. And I always used to think that the President Kennedy's not being critical enough of Joe McCarthy was a result of his sort of Irish Catholic friendship, or some that he'd been around the house and they knew him. Yeah. Yeah. But it's clear in your book that it actually was completely motivated by politics. He was, according to you, I gather, he was very aware of this swing block of voters who could easily go Democrat or Republican, but would go based on, if you were with Joe, as in Joe McCarthy. Yeah. Am I got that right, or is that unfair?
Yeah. No, I think you do. I think you have it right. There's a very large block of Irish Catholic voters in Massachusetts that remained deeply committed to Joe McCarthy, showed sort of unwavering loyalty to Joe McCarthy. By the way, to speak of resonances to our own day, showed that loyalty right to the end, as did many others around the country. As far as I've been able to determine, Robert, Joe McCarthy, even when he was going down in flames, that is to say, when he was censured by the Senate in late 1954, had a rock solid support of about 36% of Americans, which is interesting. But in Massachusetts, it's stronger still. And JFK is far from alone. In fact, if you look at Leverett Saltonstall on the Republican side, if you look at various Democratic and Republican politicians, Henry Cabot Lodge himself, they're not really willing to be very critical of Joe McCarthy. So this is not just JFK. So it is in part, as you point out, the politician in Kennedy, the shrewd politician, I guess you could say, even if it's not particularly admirable, who basically says, I need to pick my battles, and this is not one that I want to point out. We should also say, however, that there are close family connections, that Joe Kennedy Sr. in particular loves McCarthy, loves the very things that many other people found appalling, the brashness, the disdain for Senate decorum, the disdain for liberals. Joe Kennedy loved that stuff. Bobby Kennedy, we haven't talked about Robert yet today. Robert, of course, worked for McCarthy and remained devoted to the end. When McCarthy died in 1957, basically of alcoholism, who flew to the funeral quietly?
Well, you got to go
Robert
to
Kennedy.
Funeral. You got to go to a funeral for someone you work for. I mean,
yeah,
come on, that's
but he did. It's true. But he did maintain. Did Robert this kind of loyalty that, by the way, I don't think JFK remotely held. He was not close in that way to McCarthy in the way that other members of his family were. But it's also part of this unwillingness on his part to ever really challenge McCarthy. Of course, it got him into trouble with liberals in the Democratic Party later, including Mrs. Roosevelt and others who said, why on earth did you not stand up to McCarthy more than you did? So it cost him in terms of his own party, but that explains his.
But let's talk about anti-communism. I mean, President Kennedy is the original, maybe not the original, but one of the most ferocious Cold Warriors.
Mm-hmm.
And in 52 and 56 and 58 and 60 into his presidency, and I want to just ask you about that. You talk a little bit about that in the book, and it was a genuinely felt sentiment about the rise of the Soviet Union and the threat of the Soviet Union in a very Churchillian way. Is that fair to say? And talk a little bit about his anti views.
Yeah, I think it is fair to say, and I suggest he was an original Cold Warrior, late 1940s, believed genuinely, intellectually, in the existence of a Soviet threat, and that you needed to confront, as the United States, you needed to confront that threat firmly. By the way, here again, his father disagrees. They were on opposite sides with respect to World War II, isolationism, appeasement, etc. They're on opposite sides now. Joe Kennedy believes the Soviets are not going to invade anybody. The Soviets are no real threat to us, etc. Jack felt differently. He also, we should note, could see the political benefits to being firmly anti-communist, especially as the 1950s progress. And as he begins to look at the White House as a possible, target, I think he realizes that Democrats in particular can be vulnerable to charges from Republicans that they're soft on communism. And so I think that JFK's Cold Warrior position is partly a function of that concern. The other final thing I'll say here is that he does become, and I write about this in volume 1, it'll also be at least a sub-theme in volume 2, he does become more nuanced with respect to the Cold War as the 1950s progress. We even see a little bit of this in his 1951 trip to Indochina, or to the Far East with Robert and Patricia, his siblings, in which he's skeptical that the French can win in Indochina, skeptical that there's a military solution to the Indochina struggle, by extension begins to say, it's not enough for us, the United States, to be against communism. We should be. But what are we for? And how do we speak to people in the developing world in a way that resonates with them? He's also skeptical, I think, about military solutions to political problems. He's an early advocate of what my colleague Joe Nye here at Harvard has coined soft power. Kennedy, I think, believes in soft power, and we need to consider that alongside the
that's for the second volume, but the missile grap rhetoric is not soft power, and the first is his inaugural address. Not a lot of nuance in that inaugural address either.
Well, I would say on that one, Robert, that in the second half of that inaugural address, and of course, I've just been reading it lately, by the way, thinking about Biden's yesterday. Isn't it remarkable, by the way, that Kennedy's is only about 1,300 words long. Yeah. It's a remarkably short and very powerful inaugural address. But the point that I just want to make here is that if you look at the second half of Kennedy's inaugural, it's less a sort of Cold War call to arms than I had thought before I reread it. And he talks about the need to negotiate, for example, and wants to suggest that there are opportunities here to sort of lower the temperatures. But your broad point is correct. Certainly with respect to the missile gap rhetoric, certainly with respect to his basic position on foreign policy, I think we have to call him an adherent to the policy of containment and to the belief in the importance of waging and winning the Cold War.
Now we're going to take questions from audience. There is instructions on the sign-up form. I think you send an email and then they'll submit them to me, and I'm looking forward to receiving those questions. I have a couple more, and again, Professor, I always want to make sure that our guests get to say what they want to say, and if there's anything I've missed in covering or that you would particularly want people that are considering reading the book or have read the book to really get your message across, please just ignore the question and say what you want to say. But I did want to ask about the vice presidential effort in 1956 to get on the ticket with Adlai Stevenson when the nominee for the Democratic Party decided to open it up to the convention and let the convention decide. Here again, his father thought it was the dumbest thing in the history of the world, and both John and Robert decided to go forward with it. Tell us a little bit about what that meant for him in his succeeding campaign for president, or just how did that work out, and what did you learn from that?
Yeah, I mean, Joe Sr. even dropped a few F-bombs, a few choice F-bombs when he found out. He was spending the summer, as he often did, in the south of France, when he found out that Jack and Bobby were going to go for this. When Stevenson announced, great dramatic moment at the convention, excuse me, and Stevenson says, "I'm opening up this to the convention." They decide that they're going for it, and Joe Jr. is just appalled because he says, and this turned out to be true. He said, "You know what? Eisenhower's gonna demolish Stevenson. Why would you want to be part of this as the second banana on the ticket? They're going to blame it on you, the defeat, and on your Catholicism. Ergo, don't be an idiot." They decide to go for it, and it becomes a very closely contested battle. In fact, it looks right up until the end that Jack Kennedy is going to be selected. And ultimately, of course, he finishes a very close second to Estes Kefauver. What it means for him, and this is in some ways where Volume 1 ends, I think is that in some ways it's the best of all worlds, because he is a star at the convention for various reasons, because of speeches that he gives, because of this performance in the vice presidential nomination race, because of his telegenic good looks. Let's remember that this is the first campaign in which there is massive television coverage. So he comes out of this as the new star of the Democratic Party, and yet is not saddled with blame for the defeat that the ticket goes down to in November. And I think it convinces him, Robert, and ultimately his father, who comes around, that, you know what, the moment is ripe for me to go for the big prize in 1960. I may not win, but I'm in a good position to do this. And it's in part because of this, this DNC and the outcome.
One of the things that struck me about the book, especially the way it ends, is that, he'd had this, remarkable life. He had this remarkable ability to get people to follow him and to be charmed by him and to really want to work very hard for him. And the 1956 effort in the vice president candidate just solidified that as he got ready for the race in 60. But he was very well loved. He was almost too well loved. And that in that adoration could be some seeds of an entitlement feeling or an overconfidence that might come back later. What about that? Did President Kennedy have enough humility? Did he know when he might not be right? What was his attitude toward his own potential to make a mistake?
It's a really interesting question. I'm glad you asked it. I think, what I'm trying to present in both volumes, and I hope people read the book, and I'll be interested to see if they think I succeed on this, both in this first volume and in the second. I'm trying to present what is sometimes called a warts and all picture of JFK. To put it maybe somewhat more elegantly, I'm trying to humanize him. So this is a guy who made mistakes. He had shortcomings. I don't think this is one of them, however. One of the things that I think is impressive about John F. Kennedy, both when he is just a young pup and when he is the most powerful man in the world, in the White House, is his capacity for self-criticism. In some ways, he does not take himself too seriously. Yes, he could be vain. Yes, he could be self-centered. Most politicians probably have both of those, capacities, those traits. But I think he was his own most exacting critic from an early point, and I think to the end. There's also a certain, I think, intellectual humility, which I think comes in part from his historical sensibility, because he was so knowledgeable about history and about what other leaders had fared. I think it protected him in a certain way. And then finally, there is what I said earlier, this capacity for self-deprecation, not being funny about himself, that I think was both endearing, but also on some level protected him against the kind of thing that you're describing.
So we have some questions from the audience that I wanted to ask you about, and one of the most interesting ones is a question about a little bit of follow-up on this. Is how would he have dealt with the adversity of losing a political campaign? Would he have persisted? Would he have that dogged persistence, of a Richard Nixon, or would he have? What do you think about that? This is a question from the audience, but I think it's kind of an interesting question.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and of course, the simple answer is I don't know. It's hard to imagine this in some ways, but that doesn't mean it's still, I think, an important question to consider. I want to say, and maybe it partly depends on when this happens. If he has a close defeat, which he could have had, to Richard Nixon in 1960, that thing could easily have, of course, gone the other way. He won by a razor-thin margin. I don't think it's hard to imagine that he returns in 64 as the Democratic nominee, that he learns from this defeat, and because of the operation, because of the involvement of the family and Robert, and because of his skills by then as a campaigner, that he rises again and is very powerful as a candidate in 64, and probably has the inside track for that nomination. On the other hand, if he loses to Lodge in 52, which again he could have done, if Lodge had started a little earlier, lots of what ifs here because it's a pretty close election, then I kind of wonder what the future holds for John F. Kennedy. Maybe there too he rises again and he runs for governor. Maybe he takes on Saltonstall in 54, although Saltonstall was a very formidable figure in his own right. And the Kennedys thought in some ways he would be even harder to defeat than Lodge was going to be in 52. So it's an interesting counterfactual, a kind of what if question. But
We
I
have a
guess
question that asks about the extent to which people were aware of President Kennedy's or Senator Kennedy's support for Joe McCarthy, and that there seemed to be a perception that it was a secret, but that's actually not right at all. That they were very upfront about Robert Kennedy worked for Joe McCarthy, and they weren't hiding their.
No, I don't think they were. I think it was pretty common knowledge. As I said, most Massachusetts politicians were no better. So I'm not sure that there was a real problem for him in this quiet support, or at least this unwillingness to really challenge McCarthy. And by the way, most national Democrats, this surprised me, but if you look at figures like Symington or Humphrey or Kefauver or others, they're also not that willing to, or Adlai Stevenson. He said, the less said about McCarthy, the better. They're not really willing to take him on either. But yeah, no, it wasn't particularly secret. It was activists within the Democratic Party. It was people like Mrs. Roosevelt who really had a hard time, understandably, with this this action on his part. He was not, to use his 1956 book, which we haven't talked about, a most interesting book, Profiles in Courage, which I recommend to people. I write about it at some length. I recommend it to people to read it. He was not arguably a profile in courage with respect to McCarthy.
So now I've got two questions concerning, let me just check one that I hadn't thought of, but is in the question list here. Is there any indication up to the point of your book, that is the end of the 1956 vice presidential campaign, that he had any interest in civil rights?
I think he did. I don't think he was, and I write about this, and I'll write about it more, obviously, in volume 2. I don't think the daily injustices suffered by African Americans, the kinds of problems that they experienced, I don't think those moved him in a particular way. That said, if you look at his voting record in the House on civil rights, it's a very strong record in favor of civil rights. I don't think he was personally prejudiced as a person, at least in particular, and so his voting record is actually pretty good. He shifts, interestingly enough, in 56, when this vice presidential possibility becomes real. He shifts to the right because he determines, as a politician, that the Southern Democrats who are dominant in Congress, the key players on the Democratic side in Congress are Southerners. And he says to himself and to his aides, I think, if I'm going to have any chance at getting this vice presidential nomination, I have to be acceptable to the South, to Southerners. And so he shifts to the right, and he basically says that desegregation is the right thing to do, but it should be on a timetable that's consistent with what the states themselves want. And, he's not going to push for this. But yeah, I think up through 56, it's fair to say that he is an advocate of, if you will, a quiet advocate of civil rights.
And then I'm going to finish on 56 because after the Stevenson chooses someone else, Robert Kennedy signs up and sort of an aide or follows the campaign along and learns maybe what not to do as a presidential campaign.
Yeah.
You have an historic note that you say that Robert Kennedy voted for Ike.
Yeah.
56. And
he did.
And I guess that leads to a question about his attractiveness to Republicans, which goes back to where we started.
Yeah.
I mean, what is it about President Kennedy that made him more a man of the center, or even today, looking back, even a man who would appear more comfortable on the right, some might say? Do you buy into that, or what's your take on that?
He was not, I don't think he was a particularly partisan. He was not ideological. And in fact was, I think, suspicious of the extremes, both left and right. And if you read Profiles in Courage, you see this. The introduction and the conclusion, which in some ways are the most important parts of the book, and were substantially drafted by Kennedy himself. Ted Sorensen, I think, wrote most of the middle part of the book. But you see some of this. So he believed in the importance of bargaining between the parties and was not particularly ideological. I don't think myself that he was a conservative. There's a book with that title, JFK Conservative, I think it is.
We know it well. Like that. We know it well.
Yeah. And I respect the book and I respect the author, but I think that apart from a few issues, so I would say fiscal policy, I would say the Cold War, which you and I have discussed. I think he's, very much pretty in line.
Those are pretty big ones.
True, but I think on most issues, he is very much in the Democratic Party, in the center. I think he's a centrist politically, and that makes me wonder in some ways how he would fare today in our more deeply split times that we're in today. I still think he would. We can talk about this. I think he would be able to surmount those, and that gets to your question. I think he is uniquely, as far as I can tell, he's uniquely popular among Republicans after his passing. But even if you look at what Republicans had to say during his abbreviated administration, he had a lot of Republican support. I think it is because he wasn't partisan. He was a centrist. He had these winning personal attributes. He had shown his Cold War credentials, if you will. Catholics, including conservative Catholics. I mean, over 80% of Catholics voted for Kennedy in 1960. I'm pretty sure that Joe Biden got, maybe around half of the Catholic vote, maybe slightly above half. But the point is, it's much lower. All of those things together make him quite unique in his broad support.
I wanted to ask, let's finish with something about faith. In the morning of the inaugural, this inaugural, President Biden invited the majority and minority leaders of Congress to join him for Mass at St. Matthew's before going over. And it reminded me of the fact that President Kennedy went to Mass on the morning of his inaugural, very kind of unobtrusively, and more as a message to his mother that he was taking faith seriously. But, we have a lot of people at AEI who think deeply about the importance of faith. What was the extent of his faith? Was his Catholicism important to him? Was he a practicing Catholic? Was he, what did you learn about his faith in researching the book?
I think it was important to him. I think I began the study thinking that he was almost wholly secular, that he was a Catholic in name only. But I revised that view. And of course, I'm going to continue to do some research on this for the second volume of the book. But, Jackie Kennedy said, both in his life and after his death, that his Catholic faith was very important to him, that he prayed in the White House he got on his knees and prayed. And I think and I write about this, there were times when he questioned his faith and his church. I think that's neither here nor there. I think that I would argue myself, as somebody who grew up in the church, Protestant church, but nevertheless grew up in the church, that faith and doubt go together in intelligent minds. And so the fact that there were times, including when his brother was killed, we haven't mentioned the fact that his closest sibling, Kathleen, who was known as Kick, she was killed in a plane crash in 1948. The sister who was closest to him in age, Rosemary, underwent a botched lobotomy in 1941. There were these family tragedies that I think caused him to question his faith. When his father said, "You've got to split up with Inga," partly on account of the faith, I think that troubled him. But I think, Robert, that though he was not particularly devout, certainly as compared to, say, Eunice, his sister, or Robert, his brother, or his mother, as you say, I think it mattered more to him than I used to believe. And of course, in one very important way, his faith was crucial, which was in terms of his prospects as president. When he was running in 1960, the thing that he worried about the most, both in terms of the race for the nomination And then the race against Nixon was, of course, that his Catholic faith would bring him defeat. And he worried endlessly, as did his advisors, about how should we confront the fact that you're a Catholic. Nobody's ever been elected before. We had Al Smith's example in 1928, a bit of a disaster. What should we do differently? So it's maybe separate from your question, but that's folded. The political dimension of this is there as well on some level.
Well, okay, I got one more. I just can't resist because it's come to me. I think he read the biography of Melbourne that he loved so much during the time you're covering in the book. I'm not sure when he fell in love with that. Why would he have such a connection to Melbourne?
Yeah, I mean, part of this is, and we haven't talked about this, it's something I write about, but is an attraction, even in the young Kennedy, to what we sometimes call posh Englishmen and Englishwomen, to upper class British ways, the kind of stereotypes about them, the sort of coolness under fire, the insouciance, the sort of dry wit. I think that just appeals to him. He becomes, even as an Irish American, he becomes a confirmed Anglophile, which is quite fascinating. And so part of the attraction to Melbourne is that, this is somebody I can connect with. In some ways, I can even identify with some of his struggles, with how he sees the world, the sense that you're also here to enjoy life to the fullest, sort of play hard and work hard, another characteristic of upper class Brits. That's something that really appeals to him. And so that book and some of the other things he read, some of the friendships that he made, Churchill and the Churchillian example that you and I discussed briefly, all of it comes together to, in a way, shape who he is and the kind of person, the kind of politician that he wants to be. It's a fascinating part of the story, I think.
We've really enjoyed this. I hope you have. Thanks.
I have indeed.
We'll have this up on our website so people who want to see it or share it with others can do so. Professor, thanks very much for being with us. And thanks to all of you who've joined us today.